Right now, in a sealed chamber chilled colder than the space between the stars, one of the most sophisticated machines our species has ever built is finishing a calculation. It is a genuine marvel. In a few minutes, it does something the fastest ordinary computer on Earth could not finish in 1,000 lifetimes. And then, when it is done, it hands its makers a page of numbers that no one, anywhere, has the slightest use for. This is quantum computing. The technology we were promised would change everything within 5 years. That promise was made almost a decade ago. The revolution has not come. No new medicines, no cracked codes, no profitable machines. And yet the people building these computers are more certain than ever that it is all just around the corner. Something in that does not add up. By the end of tonight, you will know exactly what a growing number of scientists have quietly started to realize about quantum computers and exactly why they find it so disturbing. Get comfortable and settle in. Subscribe if you have not already, and stay with us, because the road to that answer runs through a number that shrank from 10,000 years to a single afternoon, a promise that kept resetting its own clock, and one beautiful machine humming in the cold with nothing anyone needs to compute. Let's begin. Part 1. The most anticipated machine on Earth. For most of the last 10 years, there has been one machine that the future seemed to be waiting for. Not a rocket, not a telescope, not even the artificial intelligence that would eventually crowd it out of the headlines. A computer. A very particular kind of computer, one built not out of ordinary switches flipping between 0 and 1, but out of the strange, slippery rules that govern the smallest pieces of reality. We were told it would change everything. Medicine, materials, energy, finance, the very locks that keep the world's secrets, and we were told it was almost here. The promises were specific, and that is part of what made them so easy to believe. Quantum computers would model the behavior of molecules exactly, and so they would let chemists design new medicines and new materials on a screen instead of in years of trial and error. They would untangle the impossibly complex math of how proteins fold, which sits at the root of half of modern biology. They would optimize the flow of traffic and cargo and money across the whole planet, solving in an instant the kinds of problems that choke ordinary computers, and most dramatically of all, they would one day be able to break the encryption that protects the entire digital world, the codes that guard your bank account, your messages, your government's secrets. Each of these promises was real in the sense that the underlying math genuinely suggested a quantum machine could, in principle, do these things. The question was never whether the physics allowed it. The question was when and at what size, and whether the small, noisy machines we could actually build would get us there anytime soon. You have probably felt the pull of that promise, even if you never followed the details. It arrived in clean, confident sentences. Quantum computers will design new drugs by simulating molecules atom by atom. Quantum computers will crack problems that would take an ordinary machine longer than the age of the universe. Quantum computers will arrive within 5 years, and when they do, the returns will be enormous. The word that kept coming up was revolution. Not an improvement, not a faster version of what we already had. A revolution. Here is the strange part, the part that this whole night is really about. That revolution has not come. After 10 years of the most serious effort, backed by the largest technology companies on Earth, and billions of dollars in public and private money, there is still not a single quantum computer anywhere in the world doing a single commercially useful thing that an ordinary computer could not do better and cheaper. Not one. The profitable application everyone was promised has simply not appeared. And yet, if you walk into the field today and ask the people building these machines how they feel, you will not find defeat. You will find the opposite. The scientists, the companies, the investors are more optimistic now than they have ever been. Confidence is not fading as the years pass without a payoff. Confidence is climbing. Sit with that for a second, because it is genuinely odd. Imagine any other technology that had promised to change your life within 5 years, taken 10, delivered nothing you could buy or use, and left the people selling it more certain than ever that it was about to work. You would be suspicious. You would want to know what was going on. Either the promise was never real, or the people making it know something the results are not showing, or there is some third thing, some quieter explanation, that accounts for the gap between what was promised and what arrived. That gap is the mystery. On one side of it, a decade of specific, dated, public promises that all failed to come true. On the other side, a field so confident that it is pouring more money and more talent into the problem than at any point in its history. Something has to bridge those two facts, and the thing that bridges them turns out to be far more interesting and a little more unsettling than a simple story of hype or a simple story of genius. Because the truth is not that quantum computing is a lie. That is the easy answer, the one you will find shouted in comment sections, and it is wrong. The physics is real. The machines genuinely work as machines. Some of what has been achieved in the last few years is, by any honest measure, remarkable. The truth is not that it is fake. The truth is stranger. It is that two completely different things have been braided together into a single story and told to us as if they were one. One of those things is a slow, real, difficult scientific achievement. The other is a commercial revolution that was never actually happening, and it has taken the field years and a few very blunt voices to begin pulling those two threads apart. This is a story about how that happened. It is a story about a paper trail of broken promises, made not by cranks but by the most respected names in the field. It is a story about a series of triumphant demonstrations, splashed across the front pages of the world, that quietly fell apart within a year or two of being announced. It is a story about how a number as enormous as 10,000 years can shrink to an afternoon, and what that shrinking really means. And underneath all of it, it is a story about something much older and more human than quantum physics. It is about how a civilization decides what to believe about its own future, who gets to make the promises, who profits from them, and how long it takes for the careful voices to be heard over the confident ones. Consider for a moment just how much has been placed on this one bet. Governments have committed sums that are hard to hold in the mind. The United States passed a national quantum initiative and folded quantum research into technology programs worth billions. China wrote quantum computing into its national planning and built dedicated laboratories at a scale no company could match. Europe launched a flagship program of its own. On top of all that, public money came the private flood, venture capital pouring into startups, established giants like IBM and Google and Microsoft standing up whole divisions, a stock market that would send a small quantum company's share price leaping on the strength of a single press release. When a civilization spends like that, it is not buying a product. It is buying a belief. And the belief was that the useful machine was close. Compare that to how we treated the other great promised technology of the same decade, nuclear fusion, the dream of clean, limitless energy from the same reaction that powers the sun. Fusion has been famously 30 years away for about 70 years, and we have learned, culturally, to hold it at arm's length, to smile a little when a new breakthrough is announced. Quantum computing was different. Quantum computing was not 30 years away. It was 5 years away, and then it stayed 5 years away year after year, and somehow the promise never picked up the same protective skepticism. The clock kept resetting, and each time it reset, the confidence renewed itself as if the previous countdown had never happened. There is a particular feeling that comes from realizing you have been inside a story like that. Not anger, exactly. Something quieter and more disorienting. The sense of looking back at a decade of confident announcements and noticing for the first time that the thing they were all counting down to never actually arrived, and that almost no one said so out loud. That feeling is what a growing number of people inside the field are now sitting with, and the reason it is worth 2 hours of your night is that the mechanism behind it is not exotic. It is not a conspiracy of villains. It is something far more ordinary, and therefore far harder to guard against, which is exactly why it is worth understanding slowly and completely. By the end of tonight, you will understand exactly what a growing number of scientists are starting to realize about quantum computers and exactly why they find it disturbing. Not because the machines are dangerous, because of what the whole episode reveals about the people and the money and the belief that surround them. But to get there, we have to start at the beginning, with a single, ordinary week in the summer of 2026, when two very different announcements landed within days of each other, pointing in exactly opposite directions. Part 2. 1 week in July. At the end of July in 2026, the field of quantum computing produced two pieces of news. They came from different worlds, they were written in different languages, and they carried opposite moods. Almost nobody read them side by side, but if you do, the whole contradiction we just described comes into focus, sharp and clear. The first piece of news was a triumph. On July 30th, 2026, IBM, one of the oldest and most serious names in computing, joined with researchers at the University of Chicago to announce a fresh demonstration of what the field calls quantum advantage. Their paper had a careful, technical title, something close to sampling hard circuits with verifiably high fidelity, and the achievement behind it was genuine. Their quantum computer had performed a calculation that the leading classical methods, the best ordinary supercomputing techniques we know, could not feasibly match. The machine finished in about 15 minutes. A conventional computer trying to keep up would have faced runtime so long as to be pointless. But this demonstration had a feature the earlier ones lacked, and it was the feature the team was proudest of. It was checkable. One of the quiet embarrassments of quantum computing had always been that when a machine claimed to have done something no ordinary computer could do, it was extraordinarily hard to prove the answer was actually correct, precisely because no ordinary computer could redo the work to confirm it. IBM and Chicago had built something cleverer, a task that was still crushingly hard for a classical machine but that carried its own error checking, a way to trust that the answer the quantum computer gave was the right one. For a field that had been burned before, that was the real prize: trust. So that was the first announcement, a hard problem, solved fast and provably solved correctly. If you only read that, you would close the tab thinking the revolution was on schedule. The second piece of news circulating that same stretch of the summer came from a completely different part of the intellectual world, and it read like a cold hand on the back of the neck. It was a paper by a man named Amit Hagar. Hagar is not a hardware engineer and not a company spokesman. He is a historian and philosopher of science at Indiana University in Bloomington, a scholar who has spent years studying the foundations of quantum computing itself, and who was funded in part by the United States National Science Foundation specifically to work on the theory of fault-tolerant quantum computation. In other words, this was not an outsider throwing stones. This was someone from inside the house, someone the field had paid to understand it. His paper had a title with no soft edges. He called it the NISC trap, and then, in case anyone missed the point, he added a subtitle. 8 years of demonstrations the hardware was built to lose. Read that phrase again, slowly. Built to lose. He was not saying the machines were broken. He was saying the demonstrations, the celebrated proofs that quantum computers had beaten ordinary ones were, one after another, structured in a way that guaranteed they would eventually be overtaken. And then, in the very first lines of the paper, he made the claim that would stop any specialist mid-scroll. With a single clear exception, he wrote, "Every flagship demonstration of quantum advantage from this era has, within 18 months of its announcement, been reproduced on an ordinary computer, or shown to rest on structure an ordinary computer could exploit, or closed off entirely by a mathematical proof that it was simulable all along." There is a phrase in his paper that captures the accusation more precisely than any summary can, and it is worth hearing in his own register. A demonstration that a piece of hardware can run a circuit, he writes, and that the circuit produces an observable matching a known answer, is a demonstration of competent diagnostic engineering. Read past the dry academic wording, and the meaning is almost brutal. He's saying that many of these celebrated results proved only that the machine works as a machine, that it can run the program it was given and spit out the expected pattern. That is a real accomplishment for an engineer. It tells you the device is well built. But it is not the same as proving the machine has beaten classical computers at anything, and it is very far from proving the machine is useful. The field, he argues, kept mistaking a working device for a winning one. Take a moment to feel the weight of that sentence, because it is the hinge the whole night turns on. He's saying that almost every single time quantum computing planted a flag and declared victory over classical computers, an ordinary computer caught up within about a year and a half. Sometimes it caught up by brute cleverness. Sometimes a theorem appeared showing the task had never really been out of reach. But the pattern, he argues, held for 8 straight years. One exception aside, every triumph had an expiration date, and the expiration date kept arriving. It helps to know where that word, NISC, comes from, because it sits at the centre of Hagar's argument, and it will follow us through the rest of the night. It stands for Noisy, Intermediate-Scale Quantum, and it was coined in 2018 by John Preskill, a theoretical physicist at Caltech and one of the most respected figures in the entire field. Preskill invented the term to describe the machines that were actually being built, as opposed to the perfect, error-free machines that lived only in theory. Noisy, because these computers make mistakes constantly, their delicate quantum states corrupted by the smallest disturbance. Intermediate scale, because they have enough quantum bits to be interesting, tens to a few hundred, but nowhere near enough to be truly powerful. Preskill gave the era its name, and, as we will see later, he was also careful, from the very beginning, about what he did and did not promise it would do. That care will turn out to matter enormously. Hager's target is this entire Niski era, roughly 2018 to 2026, the 8 years in his subtitle. And it is worth being precise about what he is and is not saying, because it is easy to hear a paper like this and assume the author is a crank who thinks quantum mechanics is wrong. He is not. Hager is careful to say, in as many words, that he is not a skeptic and not a believer. He is not claiming the physics is broken or that quantum computers can never work. His argument is narrower and sharper than that. It is about the demonstrations, the specific experiments held up as proof of advantage, and about the gap between what those experiments actually established and what the world was told they established. His quarrel is with the storytelling, not with the science underneath it. And that is precisely what makes it hard to dismiss. The one exception he allows himself is telling. Hager does not claim the pattern is perfect. He concedes there is a single clear case where a quantum computer did something genuinely hard, genuinely useful as a scientific measurement, and genuinely checkable against physical reality, a result that did not dissolve within 18 months. It was a particular kind of verifiable experiment, one where the machine's answer could be confirmed against something real in the world, rather than just against another computer. That single exception is a signpost. It points at where the honest frontier of the field actually sits, and we will come back to it, because the difference between that one exception and all the demonstrations that failed is the difference between real progress and a good press cycle. Now put the two announcements back together in the same week. On one side, IBM in Chicago, holding up a genuine achievement and saying, "Look how far we have come, and this time you can even check our work." On the other side, a philosopher of science who had studied the whole 8-year history saying, "Look at the pattern. These victories keep dissolving, and the reason they keep dissolving is not bad luck. It is built into how the game is being played." Both of those things can be true at once. That is the disorienting part. The IBM result can be real and careful, and even a little bit beautiful, and Hager's pattern can also be real, and the two of them can be describing the same field from the inside, and disagreeing not about the facts, but about what the facts mean. To understand how that is possible, we have to slow all the way down and ask a question that sounds simple, but turns out to be the crack that everything else falls through. When a company says its quantum computer achieved an advantage, what has it actually done? What does that word advantage really mean? Because the answer is not what most people think, and once you see it clearly, a great many headlines from the last decade start to look very different. Part 3. What advantage actually means. Let us define the word carefully, because everything else depends on it. When a company announces quantum advantage, or the older and grander phrase quantum supremacy, it means one specific thing, and only that thing. It means the quantum computer performed some calculation that would take an ordinary computer an unreasonably long time to perform. That is the entire claim. The machine did a hard sum. The sum was too hard for classical hardware to keep up with. Notice what is not in that definition. There is no requirement that the calculation be useful. There is no requirement that the answer matter to anyone, that it cure a disease, price an asset, design a battery, or crack a code. Quantum advantage is a statement about difficulty, not about value. It says the task was hard for a normal computer. It says nothing at all about whether the task was worth doing. To be fair to the field, the dream underneath all of this is genuinely profound, and it is worth honouring before we start taking it apart. Back in 1981, the physicist Richard Feynman pointed out something that still feels like a small miracle when you sit with it. Nature, at its smallest scale, runs on quantum rules, and those rules are so rich that an ordinary computer chokes trying to simulate even a modest handful of particles. So, Feynman suggested, if you want to simulate nature properly, build your computer out of the same quantum stuff that nature is made of. That single idea is the seed of the entire enterprise, and it is a beautiful one. The trouble is not the dream. The trouble is the distance between the dream and the machines we can actually build right now, and how that distance got quietly erased in the telling. This is the single most important thing to understand about the last decade of quantum headlines, and it is the thing the headlines almost never made clear. When you read that a quantum computer did something a supercomputer would need thousands of years to match, your mind naturally fills in the blank. You assume the thing it did was important, because why else would anyone build a machine to do it? But in almost every one of these landmark demonstrations, the thing the machine did was, in plain terms, to produce a spray of random-looking numbers, a distribution of values with a particular statistical shape, chosen precisely because that shape is hard for an ordinary computer to fake, and for no other reason. The task in these demonstrations is called random circuit sampling, and it is worth being honest about what it is for. It is a benchmark. Its only purpose is to be difficult for classical machines. It has no known use outside of proving that the quantum computer can do a thing classical computers struggle with. Even the IBM and Chicago result from that week in July, careful and checkable as it was, sat in this same family. The calculation was a hard-to-fake distribution of numbers, genuinely impossible for a classical machine to match in reasonable time, genuinely verifiable, and genuinely useless, in the sense that no business, no laboratory, no hospital has any reason to want that particular spray of numbers. I want you to actually picture one of these machines at work, because the image is more haunting than any headline. Come with me for a moment. Imagine you're standing in a quiet laboratory, in front of what looks like a chandelier hung upside down, a tower of gleaming gold plates and coiled cabling descending into a sealed canister. This is the coldest place for millions of miles in any direction. Inside that canister, a special refrigerator has chilled the heart of the machine to a hair above absolute zero, colder than the empty space between the stars, because the quantum bits at its center are so delicate that a single stray flicker of heat would destroy the fragile state they hold. And they are holding something extraordinary. Each of those bits is, in a real physical sense, suspended between possibilities, not settled into a 1 or a 0, but hovering across both at once, and all of them together are woven into a single shared state of dizzying complexity. The machine begins its run. For about 15 minutes, it does something that no ordinary computer on Earth could keep pace with. The delicate state evolves, interferes with itself, folds through a space of possibilities larger than the number of atoms in everything you can see. It is, without exaggeration, one of the most sophisticated physical processes our species has ever deliberately created. And then it finishes, and what it hands you, after all of that, is a list of numbers, a distribution, statistically strange, impossible to fake, and completely without use. Nobody needs these numbers. Nobody will build anything with them. Their only job was to be hard. You're standing in front of a genuine miracle of engineering, watching it produce an answer to a question no one actually needed to ask. There is something almost tender about it, if you let yourself feel it. All that human ingenuity, all that money, all those years of patient work by brilliant people, poured into cooling a chip colder than deep space and coaxing it through a calculation of extraordinary delicacy, and the reward at the end is a page of numbers that will be glanced at, recorded in a scientific paper, and then never used for anything again. It is a monument built to prove that a monument can be built, and for a proof of principle, that is entirely fair. The trouble only begins when someone stands next to that monument and tells the world it is a factory. Hold on to that image, because it is the quiet through line of this entire story, a calculation with no known use. Keep that phrase somewhere in the back of your mind. We are going to return to it, and by the end of the night it is going to mean something different than it means right now. It is worth pausing on why a machine like this can be so hard for an ordinary computer to imitate, because the reason is genuinely beautiful, and it explains both the promise and the trap. An ordinary bit is either a 0 or a 1. Two ordinary bits can be in one of 4 combinations, but only one at a time. Quantum bits are different, because each one can hover across 0 and 1 at once, and because they can be woven together, a group of them can, in a sense, hold all of their possible combinations simultaneously. Add 1 quantum bit and you do not add to the possibilities, you double them. 30 quantum bits span more than 1 billion combinations. 300 quantum bits span more combinations than there are atoms in the observable universe. To track what such a machine is doing, an ordinary computer would have to write down every one of those possibilities and update them all, and very quickly there is not enough matter in existence to build a memory large enough. That is the source of the speed-up, and it is real. The machine is not faster because it works harder. It is faster because it is exploring a space of possibility that an ordinary computer cannot even fit inside its memory. But here is the catch that the excitement tends to skip over. Holding all those possibilities is not the same as reading them out. When you finally measure a quantum computer, It does not hand you the whole enormous space it was exploring. It collapses down to a single ordinary answer, one string of zeros and ones, chosen according to the strange internal weather of the machine. The art of quantum computing, the entire difficulty of it, is arranging things so that the useful answers are the likely ones, and the useless answers cancel themselves out. For a genuinely useful problem, that arrangement is fiendishly hard to design. For the benchmark, for random circuit sampling, it is easy, precisely because you do not care what the answer is. You only care that the pattern of answers is hard to fake, and that is why the field reached for it. It was the lowest bar that still counted as a win. It let the machines prove the speed-up was real without having to solve anything anyone wanted solved. That is also why the grander early phrase quantum supremacy was chosen, and later quietly softened to quantum advantage. Supremacy sounded like domination, like the moment the new machines took the throne. In reality, the throne was symbolic. Winning at random circuit sampling is like proving you can shuffle a deck of cards in a way no one could ever predict or reproduce. Impressive, genuinely difficult, and of no use to anyone who actually wanted to play a game of cards. The demonstration proved the shuffler was powerful. It did not prove the shuffler was good for anything. None of this makes the achievement fake. It is a real and difficult thing to build a machine that can do a calculation no classical computer can match, even a useless one. Scientists have wanted to demonstrate exactly that for decades, because if you can win at a useless hard task, it is a hopeful sign that you might someday win at a useful one. The demonstration is a proof of principle, a flag planted to say, the physics works, the speed-up is real, now let us go find something worth doing with it. That is a perfectly respectable scientific goal, and the people pursuing it are, for the most part, serious and honest. The problem is what happened between the laboratory and the public. In the laboratory, quantum advantage meant a careful, narrow, technical thing. A hard benchmark, cleared. But by the time that result had passed through a press release, a headline, an investor deck, and a consulting report, it had been quietly transformed into something enormous. The revolution is here. The useful machines have arrived. The commercial era has begun. The gap between what was actually demonstrated and what was actually claimed is where this whole story lives. And to see just how wide that gap grew, we need to look at the promises themselves, the specific, dated, public promises that credible people made about when the useful machines would arrive. Because those promises were not vague. They came with years attached, and the years have almost all come and gone. Part 4. The promises with dates attached. The strongest part of this whole story is not anyone's opinion. It is a paper trail. Because the near-term promise, the claim that useful, profitable quantum computers were just a few years away, was not whispered. It was made openly, repeatedly, and with specific dates attached by the most credible names in the field. And when a promise comes with a date, the world eventually gets to check it. So let us check them, one by one. I want you to picture these not as abstract predictions, but as rooms, confident rooms, each one full of intelligent people who believed what they were saying. Step into the first room. The year is 2017. In March of that year, the journal Nature, one of the most prestigious scientific publications on Earth, published a commentary with a title that left no room for doubt: Commercialize Quantum Technologies in 5 Years. It was written by members of Google's quantum computing team, serious researchers, people at the absolute frontier of the field. Their argument was that short-term returns were possible, that even the small and noisy devices about to emerge would deliver real commercial value within 5 years. 5 years from 2017 is 2022, so let us walk to 2022 and look around. There was no commercial return from small quantum devices in 2022. There was no quantum product on the market solving real problems for real customers. The 5 years passed, the door quietly closed, and the revolution was not inside. It did not happen. Step into the second room. The year is 2018. Researchers from IBM, another of the most respected names in computing, are describing the near future. In the near term, they argue, these noisy machines have the best potential to deliver business advantage. One of them describes the coming years as the dawn of the commercial quantum era, not the distant future, the dawn now beginning. So let us walk forward from 2018 and watch for that dawn. The near term came, the near term went, and the commercial quantum era did not dawn, at least not in any form you could point to on a balance sheet, not as a single business advantage that anyone actually captured. It did not happen. Step into the third room. The year is 2021. The company is IonQ, a quantum computing firm that had just gone public and was now speaking to investors in its annual report. During this noisy era, IonQ wrote, we expect quantum machine learning to be the first solution to transition into broadly available applications, the first broadly available application arriving during the NISQ years. They pointed to a demonstration in financial analysis and projected that quantum machine learning could become a revenue opportunity worth more than $1 billion a year by 2026. 2026 is now. This year. Look around you. The broadly available quantum machine learning application did not arrive. There is no such product in wide use, generating anything close to those revenues. It did not happen. Step into the fourth room. The date is precise this time, August 11th, 2023. Enrique Solano, a co-founder of the German quantum startup Kipu Quantum, states that the company is working to reach a real-world advantage for industry use cases within 18 to 36 months. Do the arithmetic. 36 months from August of 2023 lands almost exactly on the moment this video is being made. The window he named has closed, right now, as you listen. And the industry advantage he pointed to has not materialized. It did not happen. There is a small, sharp irony hiding in that last room, the one from 2023. Kipu Quantum built its whole business around a specific bet, the bet that clever software could squeeze genuine usefulness out of exactly these small, noisy, imperfect machines, right now, without waiting for the big perfect computers of the future. That was the entire NISQ wager, the belief that the noisy era itself would pay off if you were smart enough about how you used it. And that wager, the one Hagar aims his whole paper at, is the one that kept coming due and kept not paying. The people making it were not fools. They were in many cases brilliant. They simply believed sincerely in a near future that kept refusing to become the present. I want you to stand in these rooms for a moment, because there is a scene here worth living inside rather than just reading about. You're moving down a long hallway, and the hallway is lined with doors, and behind each door is one of these confident rooms, frozen at the moment the promise was made. Open the first and it is 2017, and someone is standing at a whiteboard saying 5 years, and the room is nodding. Close it, walk on, open the next, and it is 2018, and someone is saying the dawn is here, and the room believes it. The next door, 2021, an investor presentation, bright slides, $1 billion by 2026. The next, a summer afternoon in 2023, 18 to 36 months. In every room the mood is the same, bright, certain, imminent. And here is the strange thing you notice as you walk. Not one of these rooms knows about the others. Each one is making almost exactly the same promise, with the clock reset to 0, as if the previous countdown had never run out. You're walking through 8 years of the same 5-year promise, made again and again, and every single time the audience believes it is hearing it for the first time. Nobody in any of these rooms is lying. That is what makes the hallway so unsettling. They all mean it. The promises did not stay inside the laboratories and the companies either. They spilled outward, into the world of consultants and market analysts, where hope gets converted into hard numbers with dollar signs in front of them. In 2019, the Boston Consulting Group, one of the most influential advisory firms on the planet, predicted that value to end users in certain sectors would reach a relatively modest $2 to $5 billion by 2024, with as much as $10 billion accruing to users and providers within 3 to 5 years, if the technology scaled as promised. That little clause at the end, if the technology scaled as promised, would turn out to carry all the weight. The value delivered to end users by 2024 turned out to be even more modest than their modest estimate. It was, as near as anyone can tell, essentially nothing. And here is what the same firm did next, and it is a move worth watching closely, because you will see it again and again once you know to look for it. By 2024, with the near-term numbers having failed to appear, the Boston Consulting Group did not issue a retraction. It issued a new forecast. The commercial inflection point, they now said, would arrive around 2030. And the truly enormous figure, hundreds of billions of dollars in value, was pushed all the way out to 2040. Notice what happened there. The prediction did not get smaller when it failed. It got bigger and it moved further away, safely beyond the horizon where anyone could check it anytime soon. A forecast that fails in the near term does not die. It retreats to a distance where it cannot be tested, and it grows on the way. Once you have seen that move once, you start to see it everywhere in this field, and it stops looking like a series of individual mistakes and starts looking like a shape. The shape is this. A prediction is made for a near date. The near date arrives without the prediction coming true. Instead of a correction, a new prediction appears, with the clock reset and the horizon pushed out. And crucially, at no point does anyone have to admit they were wrong, because by the time the old promise expires, everyone's attention has already moved to the new one. It is not that any single person is dishonest. It is that the whole system has no memory. Each new forecast is born innocent, unburdened by the corpses of the forecast before it. And so the same 5-year promise can be made in 2017, and again in 2020, and again in 2025, and each time it feels fresh, because nobody's holding up the previous one next to it. It is worth being fair about the IonQ case in particular, because it reveals something about how these promises are shaped. IonQ made its billion-dollar projection in documents aimed at investors at a company that had just become publicly traded through a stock market listing. That does not make the projection a lie, but it does mean the promise was doing a job beyond describing the science. It was helping to justify a valuation, to attract capital, to keep a share price aloft. And that is a thread we are going to follow later, because once you notice that optimism is not just a scientific judgment, but also a financial instrument, a great deal of the mismatch we are trying to explain starts to come clear. There is a line that comes out of this history, and I want to offer it to you gently, because it is funny in the way that true things are sometimes funny. To this day, after all these years and all these billions, the single most reliably profitable quantum application has not been in medicine, or finance, or materials, or cryptography. It has been the business of forecasting profitable quantum applications. The predictions have made real money. The predicted products have not. Now, before this tips over into simple mockery, I want to introduce a quieter figure standing at the edge of all these bright rooms, because he matters enormously for where we are going. Remember John Preskill, the physicist who gave this whole era its name. Preskill was as close to the centre of the field as anyone alive. He could have made the same promises. He had every incentive to, and he did not. When he coined the term, he was careful, almost pointed, about what these noisy machines would and would not do. They would be fascinating for scientific research, he said. They might someday prove useful. But he specifically declined to claim that they would deliver commercial value anytime soon. In a hallway full of people announcing the dawn, the man who named the era stood quietly to one side and refused to say it. That refusal is easy to miss. It is not a headline. Nobody writes a news story about the promise a scientist chose not to make. But it is one of the most important signals in this entire story, and it points to a lesson we are going to return to at the very end. Sometimes the relevant thing is not what the confident voices say. Sometimes the relevant thing is what the most careful person in the room declines to say. Hold on to that, the way we are holding on to the useless miracle and the phrase that keeps repeating, "It did not happen." Because a pattern of failed promises is troubling on its own, but it becomes something much stranger when you set it next to the demonstrations, the triumphant proofs of advantage that were supposed to back those promises up. Because those, it turns out, have a habit of falling apart too, and the most famous of them fell apart in a way that is almost hard to believe. Part 5. 10,000 Years to an Afternoon. To understand what happens to these demonstrations, we need to follow the most famous one all the way through, from its triumphant birth to its quiet unravelling. It is the story of a machine called Sycamore, and it is the clearest window we have into the pattern Hager was describing. In October of 2019, Google made an announcement that travelled around the world. Its quantum processor, named Sycamore, had achieved what Google called quantum supremacy. It had performed one of those random circuit sampling tasks, the hard-to-fake spray of numbers we talked about, and Google estimated the scale of the achievement with a single number that landed like a thunderclap. To do the same task, they said, the most powerful classical supercomputer on Earth would need about 10,000 years. 10,000 years. Think about what that number does to you when you first hear it. 10,000 years ago, human beings were just beginning to farm. The entire span of recorded civilization, every pyramid and empire and cathedral and moon landing, fits inside 10,000 years. Google was saying that its refrigerator-sized chip had done, in a few minutes, something that would take the finest machine humanity could build longer than all of written history. If that were the whole story, it really would have been the dawn of a new age, exactly as the headlines proclaimed. But the number did not hold, and the way it came apart is the heart of this part, so I want you to watch it happen slowly, as if you were standing beside that 10,000-year figure and watching it melt. Picture the number written on a wall, enormous and glowing. 10,000 years. The ink is barely dry, and almost immediately, within days of Google's announcement, a rival team at IBM walks up to the wall. They point out that Google's estimate assumed a certain clumsy way of using the supercomputer, and that if you let the classical machine use all of its enormous storage cleverly, the same task could be done not in 10,000 years, but in about 2.5 days. Watch the number on the wall flicker and shrink. 10,000 years, crossed out. 2.5 days written beneath it. The gap has collapsed from the length of civilization to the length of a long weekend, and Google's machine has not gotten any slower. The classical world just got smarter. Now let the clock run forward. It is 2021. Two researchers, Feng Pan and Pan Zhang, announce a new mathematical technique, a way of reorganizing the problem that lets an ordinary computer reproduce, or spoof, the very output Sycamore had produced. The number on the wall shudders again. Then it is 2022, and in a paper published in Physical Review Letters, a team completes the same sampling task that was supposed to take 10,000 years on a cluster of ordinary processors in roughly 15 hours. Watch the wall now. 10,000 years, 2.5 days, and now 15 hours, 1 working day, an afternoon and an evening. And it did not stop there. With better hardware, arrays of the graphics chips that power video games and artificial intelligence, later estimates brought the same task down toward mere minutes. Stand back and look at the wall. In the span of about 3 years, the 10,000-year gap, the number that had announced a new era had shrunk to an afternoon and then toward minutes. The single figure that had justified the phrase quantum supremacy had lost, in the end, almost 4 orders of magnitude. The classical computers had caught up so completely that the original claim, the 10,000 years, now reads less like a measurement and more like a story we told ourselves in a moment of excitement. Try to feel what that shrinking would have been like from the inside, for the people who had built Sycamore. When you announce 10,000 years, you are not just reporting a result. You are staking a claim about your place in history. The headlines call it the dawn of a new age. Presidents and prime ministers mention your work. Your company's name becomes shorthand for the future. And then, quietly, in the technical literature where the public never looks, the number that carried all of that begins to come apart. Not with a scandal, not with a retraction, just with a series of careful papers by other clever people, each one shaving the estimate down. There is no single dramatic moment where the achievement is declared overturned. There is only the slow erosion and the strange experience of watching the ground settle beneath something you had planted a flag on. And Sycamore was not alone in this. It had a cousin, a different kind of quantum advantage demonstration built out of light rather than superconducting circuits, a technique called boson sampling, in which photons are sent through a maze of beam splitters and the pattern of where they land is the hard-to-fake output. Boson sampling had its own triumphant announcements, its own headlines about tasks beyond classical reach, and it had its own history of classical counterattacks, its own papers showing that ordinary computers could, with enough cleverness, approximate what the photonic machines had done. The specific hardware was different. The pattern was identical, a flag planted far out at sea and the tide coming in behind it. This is the rhythm that Hager's 18-month window is trying to name. It is not that every quantum result is instantly debunked. It is that the gap between quantum and classical, the gap that gets sold to the public as a permanent leap, has repeatedly turned out to be temporary, closing within a year or two as the classical side sharpens its tools. And there is a reason the classical side keeps finding room to improve, which is worth understanding. When Google first estimated 10,000 years, it was estimating how long the best-known classical method would take. But there is no law that says the best-known method is the best possible method. Every time a quantum team says no classical computer can do this, they are really saying no classical computer that we currently know how to program can do this. Those are very different statements, and the space between them is exactly where the 10,000 years went. I want to be careful and fair here, because this is exactly the kind of moment where it would be easy to overclaim in the other direction. The people who caught up to Sycamore were doing brilliant, difficult work, and the fact that they could do it does not mean Sycamore was worthless or that Google was dishonest. Random circuit sampling really is hard for classical computers in a fundamental sense, and for larger, more complex versions of the task, the classical methods still struggle badly. The point is not that quantum computers are useless. The point is narrower and stranger. It is that the specific number used to sell the achievement, the 10,000 years, was fragile in a way the headlines never conveyed. It was not a fixed fact about the universe. It was a snapshot of how good classical computers happened to be on the day of the announcement, and classical computers do not stand still. This is the pattern Amit Hager was pointing at, and Sycamore is only the most famous example of it. A demonstration is announced with a spectacular claim about how far beyond classical reach it is. The announcement travels the world, and then, over the following months and years, the classical world quietly closes the distance, sometimes by clever engineering, sometimes by a new algorithm, sometimes by a mathematical proof that the task was never as hard as it looked. The flag gets planted, and then the tide comes in, and the flag is standing in the shallows, and everyone has already moved on to the next beach. It is worth knowing, in plain terms, how the classical teams pulled off their catch-up, because the method itself tells you something. They used an approach called a tensor network, which is, at its simplest, a very clever way of not doing the impossible. Instead of tracking every one of the astronomically many possibilities the quantum machine explores, a tensor network finds the hidden structure in the problem, the places where possibilities overlap or cancel or repeat, and uses that structure to avoid ever writing the whole thing down. Think of it like a map maker who realizes she does not need to record the position of every grain of sand on a coastline to draw an accurate map, only the shape of the shore. The quantum machine had been treated as if it were exploring a truly featureless, structureless space that no shortcut could tame. The classical teams found the shortcuts, and the fact that they could find them is a hint, one that skeptics like Hagar take seriously, that these benchmark tasks may carry more exploitable structure than the original claims assumed. Now sit with what it means that the number lost almost 4 orders of magnitude. It is not just that a specific estimate turned out to be too high. It is that the flagship demonstration of a new computing age, the single result most often cited as proof that quantum machines had arrived, ended up overstating the gap by a factor of tens of millions. If a bridge were advertised as 10,000 feet long and turned out to be a few inches, you would not simply adjust your notes. You would start asking hard questions about how the measurement was made and who benefited from the larger number, and why nobody in the room pushed back at the time. Those are exactly the questions that a growing number of people in and around the field have finally started asking out loud, and they are the questions that make this whole subject feel less like a technology story and more like a story about human belief. There is one more thing about Sycamore worth sitting with, and it will matter enormously in the next part because it points to a trap hiding inside the whole idea of these demonstrations. When the classical teams reproduced Sycamore's output, it raised a deeply uncomfortable question. If an ordinary computer can produce the same spray of numbers, how did anyone ever confirm in the first place that Sycamore's numbers were correct? How do you check the answer to a problem so hard that no ordinary computer can solve it? Because if no classical machine can solve it, then no classical machine can grade it either. And that, it turns out, is not a small practical annoyance. It is a trap built into the very foundation of how quantum advantage has been demonstrated, and once you see it clearly, you cannot unsee it. Part 6. Built to Lose. Let us return now to Amit Hager and his paper, because with Sycamore fresh in your mind, his argument stops being an abstract accusation and becomes something you can feel the shape of. Remember his central claim. With a single clear exception, every flagship demonstration of quantum advantage from this era has, within 18 months, been reproduced on an ordinary computer, or shown to rest on structure an ordinary computer could exploit, or closed off by a proof that it was simulable all along. Sycamore is not the outlier in that sentence. Sycamore is the template. And it is that word in his subtitle that I want to sit with tonight because it is doing a great deal of work. Built to lose. He is not saying the machines are badly made. He is saying something more subtle and more disturbing. He is saying that the demonstrations themselves, the specific experiments chosen to prove quantum advantage, were selected in a way that made their eventual defeat almost inevitable. And once you understand why, you cannot look at these announcements the same way again, Here is the logic. To demonstrate quantum advantage, you need a task that a quantum computer can do, and a classical computer cannot. But you are working with small, noisy machines that make errors constantly and cannot yet do anything complicated for very long, so you cannot pick a genuinely useful task, because useful tasks require the machine to run long, careful, error-free computations that these machines simply cannot sustain. What you can pick is a task that plays to the machine's one natural strength, its ability to produce a fantastically complex, random-looking output very quickly, and so you reach for random circuit sampling, the spray of numbers with no use. It is the one thing a noisy machine can do that looks impossible for a classical computer. But here is the trap folded inside that choice. The very thing that makes random circuit sampling a good demonstration, its raw statistical complexity, is also the thing that leaves it exposed. Because it has no useful structure of its own, the only question is whether classical mathematicians can find some hidden pattern to exploit. And classical mathematicians are very, very good at finding hidden patterns. Given a year or two, they usually do. So the task is chosen precisely because it is hard for classical computers today, with no guarantee and often no real expectation that it will stay hard tomorrow. The demonstration is a race, and the quantum side gets a head start, but the classical side is allowed to keep training after the starting gun. Built to lose does not mean built to fail. It means built to win a race whose finish line keeps sliding backward toward the classical runner. Now, I promised earlier we would come back to the one exception Hager allows, and this is the moment, because the exception is the most illuminating part of the whole argument. There was, he concedes, a single demonstration that did not dissolve within 18 months. It was a different kind of experiment, one where the quantum computer was not just producing a hard-to-fake spray of numbers, but computing something that could be checked against physical reality, an actual measurable feature of an actual physical system. Because its answer could be verified against the world, rather than only against another computer, it did not have the fatal weakness of the sampling demonstrations. It could be trusted, and it could not be trivially reproduced by finding a shortcut, because it was anchored to something real. That single exception is not a footnote. It is a map. It shows exactly where the honest frontier of quantum computing actually sits, not in ever larger sprays of useless numbers, whose only virtue is momentary classical hardness, but in verifiable computations tied to real physical questions. The exception is the field pointing, almost despite itself, at the difference between a demonstration built to lose and a result built to last. And it is worth noticing that IBM and Chicago's careful, checkable result from that week in July, the one we started with, was reaching in exactly this direction, toward verifiability, toward trust. The field is, slowly, learning the lesson its own critic is trying to teach it. It helps to have an image for this, so let me offer one. Imagine you want to prove you are the fastest runner in the world, but you are only allowed to race on a track where the finish line is drawn by your competitors after the race, based on how fast they eventually learn to run. On the day of your race, you sprint faster than anyone alive, and the finish line is drawn far ahead of everyone else, and you are declared the champion. But your competitors keep training. A year later, they can run to where your finish line was, so the judges move the line, and now you are only barely ahead. Another year, and they have caught you completely, and the line sits right at your heels. You never got slower. You ran exactly as fast as you always did, but the meaning of your victory drained away, because it was never really a fixed distance you had beaten. It was only the gap between you and where your rivals happened to be standing on one particular afternoon. That is what quantum advantage by random circuit sampling has looked like, over and over, for 8 years. And there is a further layer to Hager's worry, one that reaches past the demonstrations and into the promised future itself. The whole case for large, useful quantum computers rests on an idea called fault tolerance, the ability to combine many error-prone quantum bits into a few reliable ones by constantly detecting and correcting mistakes. There is a beautiful piece of mathematics called the threshold theorem, which proves that if the errors are small enough and behave in a certain well-mannered way, this correction can be made to work at any scale. It is the theoretical guarantee that the big machines are possible at all. But Hager and other careful thinkers point out something easy to miss. That theorem assumes the errors are independent and quick to fade, that they do not conspire together in complicated, correlated ways. And that assumption is not a law of physics. It is a hope about how real hardware will behave when it gets large. there is already some evidence that real machines show exactly the kind of correlated, stubborn noise the theorem assumes away. So the guarantee that the useful machines are coming may rest, in the end, not on a proof, but on a wager about the physical world, a wager that has not yet been settled. That does not mean the machines are impossible. It means the confidence that they are inevitable is standing on ground softer than the public was told. But I want to slow down now, because underneath the logic there is a feeling here, and it is the emotional centre of this whole story. Let it land fully. Think about what it means to say that the celebrated proofs of a new computing age were, one after another, structured in a way that guaranteed they would be overtaken. This is not the story of a fraud. Nobody faked a result. The machines did exactly what they were reported to do. The numbers were real, and that is what makes it so much stranger than a simple scandal. Imagine a field of brilliant, sincere people, standing up year after year to applaud demonstrations that were, in a quiet structural sense, designed to be beaten. Imagine the world's press gathering each time to announce a permanent leap forward, when the thing being announced had a hidden expiration date built into its very design. Not one villain anywhere in the picture, just a whole community and a whole watching world, mistaking a race with a moving finish line for a finish line already crossed. There is a particular vertigo in that. It is the vertigo of realizing that a story you trusted was not false, exactly, but was quietly not what it appeared to be, and that the not-quite truth was held in place not by any liar but by everyone's shared, sincere excitement. It is the same vertigo you might feel looking back at any moment when a crowd, yourself included, believed something together that turned out to be built on air. Nobody meant to mislead. The misleading was a property of the whole system, not of any person inside it. And that is a far more unsettling thing to confront than a simple lie, because you cannot fix it by finding the liar. There is no liar to find. You have almost certainly lived a smaller version of this yourself. A stock that everyone around you was buying, a diet everyone swore by, a plan at work that the whole room was sure would succeed. In the moment, the shared certainty feels like evidence. If everyone smart believes it, how could it be wrong? And then, later, looking back, you see that the belief was holding itself up, that each person was reassured mostly by the confidence of the others, and that no one, including you, had actually checked the floor beneath their feet. The quantum computing story is that ordinary human experience scaled up to the level of an entire global scientific field, with the world's most prestigious institutions in the role of the confident crowd, and with billions of dollars and the direction of a generation of research resting on the shared certainty. That is why it is worth understanding slowly. It is not only a story about a technology, it is a story about the way belief moves through even the most careful and intelligent communities we have. So we are left with a genuine puzzle, and it is the puzzle that will carry us through the rest of the night. If the demonstrations keep dissolving, and the promises keep failing, and there is no villain to blame, then why does the field believe more strongly than ever that quantum computing will change the world? A cynic has an easy answer ready. The cynic says it is all a bubble, all hype, all money, and that everyone involved is either a fool or a fraud. But we have just seen that the cynic is wrong, that there are no frauds here and very few fools. So the real answer must be more interesting than the cynic's, and to find it, we have to look at a trap hiding inside these demonstrations that is more fundamental even than the one Hagar named. A trap in the very idea of proving that a machine has done the impossible. Part 7. The trap inside the trap. We ended the last part with a question about a trap hidden inside the very idea of proving a machine did the impossible, and now we have to face it directly, because it is the strangest and most important piece of the entire puzzle. It is a trap made of pure logic, and once you see it, the whole difficulty of quantum computing snaps into a sharper focus. Here is the problem, stated as simply as it can be. Suppose a quantum computer performs one of these random circuit sampling tasks and hands you its spray of numbers. How do you know the numbers are right? For any ordinary calculation, you check the answer by doing the calculation another way and seeing if you get the same result. But the entire premise of a quantum advantage demonstration is that no ordinary computer can do this calculation. That is the whole point. So there is no second way to do it. There is no answer key. You cannot simply grade the quantum computer's homework, because grading the homework would require solving the very problem you just declared unsolvable for classical machines. Sit with how peculiar that is. To prove the machine did something no classical computer can do, you would need a classical computer to confirm the answer, which by definition it cannot. The demonstration's greatest strength, its classical hardness, is also the reason it cannot be directly verified, and it gets sharper still. When the classical teams reproduced Sycamore, they showed that faking the output, producing a convincing spray of numbers without a quantum computer, is roughly as hard as genuinely checking the quantum computer's real output. Faking and verifying turn out to be about equally difficult. So the classical world can, with great effort, either check the answer or counterfeit it, and it takes about the same enormous effort to do either. That is a deeply uncomfortable place to build a proof. So how did the field cope with this? It leaned on a clever statistical workaround, a method usually called cross-entropy benchmarking. Rather than checking every number the quantum computer produced, you run the machine many times, collect its outputs, and measure a certain statistical signature, a score that tells you how closely the machine's behavior matches what a perfect quantum computer running that circuit should theoretically produce. If the score is high, you argue, the machine must be doing genuine quantum work. It is an ingenious approach, and it is not nothing. But notice the circle it draws. To compute the theoretical target the machine is being compared against, for the hardest cases you once again run into the wall of classical intractability. The verification method works well for smaller circuits you can still classically check, and then you extrapolate, you assume, that the machine keeps behaving the same way as you scale up into the region where you can no longer check it at all. You're trusting that the machine stays honest, precisely in the regime where you have lost the ability to catch it if it does not. I am not saying anyone cheated. I want to be clear about that. The physicists doing this work are careful and honest, and cross-entropy benchmarking is a legitimate, thoughtful tool. The point is structural, not moral. The point is that the whole enterprise of demonstrating quantum advantage sits on a foundation where the strongest claims are, by their nature, the hardest to independently confirm, and a claim that is spectacular and nearly impossible to check in the moment is, whether anyone intends it or not, the perfect fuel for a hype cycle. It can be announced with confidence. It cannot be easily refuted right away. And by the time the careful corrections trickle in, months or years later, in technical papers the public never reads, the headlines have already been printed, the funding has already flowed, and the world's attention has already moved to the next announcement. There is an everyday way to feel how strange this is. Imagine a student hands in the answer to a problem in a subject so advanced that no teacher in the school actually understands it. The student is the only one in the building who can do the work. How does the school grade the exam? It cannot check the answer directly, because no one else can solve the problem, so it does the next best thing. It gives the student a few easier versions of the problem, ones the teachers can check, confirms the student gets those right, and then simply trusts that the student is equally honest and capable on the hard version no one can verify. Most of the time, that trust is reasonable, but notice that it is trust, not proof, and notice that if the student ever did make a mistake, or exaggerate precisely on the hard problem, there would be no way for the school to catch it. That is roughly the epistemic position the whole field has been in. It can verify the small cases and it extrapolates to the large ones, and the extrapolation lives exactly in the region where the stakes and the claims are largest. And this is not a small technicality confined to one or two experiments. It shapes the entire public conversation about quantum computing, because it means the most dramatic announcements are, structurally, the ones that arrive faster than their own verification. The pattern practically writes itself. A result is announced. The press reports it at full strength, usually with the largest, most astonishing framing, because that is what makes a headline. The careful caveats, if they appear at all, appear far down the page. Then, over the following year or two, the quiet machinery of science does its slow work. The reproductions, the reanalyses, the theorems, and the result is revised downward, or matched classically, or hedged. But that machinery moves at the speed of peer review, while the headline moved at the speed of a press release. The two are not running the same race. The correction almost always arrives after the belief has already set, like a retraction printed in a newspaper nobody reads anymore. This is exactly the gap that the IBM and University of Chicago result from that week in July was built to close, and now you can appreciate why the field was proud of it. Their whole innovation was to construct a task that was still crushingly hard for classical machines, but that carried its own way of checking the answer, so that trust no longer depended on an act of faith about behavior you could not observe. It was the field trying at last to climb out of the trap. Whether it fully succeeds is still being argued over, but the very fact that verifiability became the headline feature tells you the field had finally recognized the trap for what it was. Now let us stop and step back and put all the pieces on the table together, because we are at the middle of the story and it is worth seeing the whole shape at once before we turn toward the answer. We started with a mismatch. A decade of promises that useful, profitable quantum computers were a few years away, and a decade of those promises quietly failing, one dated prediction after another. Then we looked closer and found that the word advantage never meant what the public thought, that the celebrated demonstrations produced hard but useless sprays of numbers. Then we watched the most famous of those demonstrations, Sycamore, lose almost all of its 10,000-year gap as classical computers caught up. And we learned from Hagar that this was not an accident but a pattern, that the demonstrations were, in a structural sense, built to lose. And now we have found the trap beneath the trap, the fact that these advantage claims are, by their very nature, almost impossible to verify in the moment they are made, which makes them ideal for generating excitement and terrible for settling the actual scientific question. Line all of that up and you would expect a field in retreat. Failed promises, dissolving demonstrations, unverifiable claims. You would expect the money to be drying up, the confidence to be cracking, the mood to be sober or even grim. And that is precisely where the real mystery announces itself, because that is the opposite of what is happening. The field is not in retreat. The money is not drying up. The confidence is not cracking. By every visible measure, quantum computing is more energized, better funded, and more optimistic than at any moment in its history. And notice one more thing before we turn the corner, because it will save us from the cynic's trap. Everything we have laid out so far is about the demonstrations and the promises, the public-facing spectacle of quantum computing. It is entirely possible for that spectacle to be shaky and misleading while, underneath it, something genuine is quietly getting better. A magician's patter can be pure misdirection, while the hands doing the real work are in fact extraordinarily skilled. The failed promises tell us the marketing was wrong. They do not by themselves tell us the engineering was standing still. To find out whether anything real is happening, we have to stop watching the stage and look at the hands. So the question is no longer whether the promises failed. They did. The question is how a field can absorb a decade of failed promises and dissolving demonstrations and emerge more confident than ever, and whether that confidence is madness or manipulation, or whether it is pointing at something real that the failures have hidden from view. Because it turns out there is a real thing the failures have hidden, and to see it, we have to look away from the demonstrations that keep collapsing and toward a quieter kind of progress that has been happening in the background the entire time. Part 8. Why the optimism keeps rising. So let us look at the hands, not the stage. And when you do, you find something that the story of failed promises leaves out entirely, something quiet and real that has been happening in the background the whole time. Because while the flashy advantage demonstrations were being announced and then dissolving, a different kind of work was going on, less glamorous, harder to turn into a headline, and far more important. It is the work of error correction, and it is the single most hopeful thread in this entire story. To understand why it matters, you have to understand the most fundamental problem quantum computers face, the one underneath all the others. Quantum bits are almost unbearably fragile. The delicate state that gives them their power, that hovering between possibilities, is destroyed by the faintest disturbance, a stray photon, a whisper of heat, a tiny vibration. Left alone, a quantum bit forgets what it was doing in a fraction of a second. This is the noise in noisy intermediate scale quantum. It is why these machines cannot yet run long, useful computations. They fall apart before they finish. Every serious person in the field has always known that until this problem is solved, the useful machines cannot exist. Not will not. Cannot. The proposed solution has been understood in theory for decades, and it is genuinely elegant. You do not try to make a single perfect quantum bit, because that may be impossible. Instead, you spread the information of one reliable bit across many unreliable ones, and you constantly watch for errors and correct them on the fly, faster than they accumulate. Combine enough flawed physical bits in the right pattern, and together they can behave as one far more reliable bit, what physicists call a logical qubit. It is a little like how a rumour whispered through a single person gets garbled. but a fact confirmed by 100 independent witnesses can be trusted even if any one of them misremembers. The catch has always been a brutal threshold. For this to work, your physical bits have to be good enough to begin with. If they are too noisy, adding more of them just adds more errors, and the whole scheme makes things worse instead of better. For decades, the machines were on the wrong side of that line, and then, in December of 2024, something genuinely important happened. Something that deserved more attention than most of the flashy demonstrations that got it. Google announced results from a chip called Willow that, for the first time in a convincing way, crossed to the right side of that threshold. As they added more physical bits to their error-correcting pattern, the error rate of the logical bit went down, not up. That is the whole game, in a single sentence. Adding more qubits made the encoded information more reliable rather than less. It is the first real, measured sign that the central obstacle, the one everyone agreed had to be overcome, can in fact be overcome. It is not a useless spray of numbers. It is a checkable, structural advance on the exact problem that stands between us and the useful machines. Now, hold this next to everything we have said, because here is where the whole story turns and where the mismatch finally starts to make sense. The commercial promises failed, the advantage demonstrations dissolved, but this, the slow climb toward error correction, is real, and it is moving, and the people who work on it can see it moving with their own instruments. When such a person tells you they are more optimistic than ever, they are not being irrational, and they are not lying to you. They are looking at a different thing than the promises were about. The promises were about money and speed, about profitable applications arriving next year. Those failed. But the belief is about this, the fundamental engineering barrier finally starting to give way. And on that front, there really has been progress worth being excited about. There is a caution worth keeping even here, because we have learned to be careful. One good result is not a finished machine. Crossing the threshold in a small demonstration is a long way from stringing together the thousands or millions of physical bits a truly useful computer would need, and there are real, unsolved problems on that road, including the worry we raised earlier, that the noise in very large machines might turn out to be more stubborn and more correlated than the neat theory assumes. The honest position is not that the useful machines are now guaranteed. The honest position is that the single most important barrier, the one that had to fall for any of it to be possible, has finally shown that it can fall. That is genuinely good news, and it is also not the same thing as a promise. Holding both of those at once is the discipline this whole subject demands. This is the key that unlocks the paradox. Optimism and results have not actually been moving in opposite directions. They have been moving on two different tracks that the public was told were one. On the commercial track, the track of useful, profitable machines, the results genuinely have not come, and honest people admit it. On the scientific track, the track of solving the physics of error correction, the results genuinely have come, and honest people are right to be encouraged. The confusion, the whole decade of confusion, comes from the fact that these two tracks were braided together and sold as a single story of imminent revolution, when really one thread was a slow scientific triumph in progress, and the other was a commercial fantasy that kept expiring. It is worth dwelling on just how hard won that Willow result was, because the drama of it is real, even if it never made the front pages the way the 10,000-year claim did. For years, error-correcting schemes had been stuck in a frustrating place. You would build a small version, and it would work a little. You would build a slightly bigger version, expecting it to work better, and instead it would work worse, because the extra components brought in more noise than the correction could remove. It was like trying to bail out a boat with a bucket that leaks faster the bigger it gets. Crossing below the threshold means, for the first time, the bucket stops leaking faster than it bails. Google showed that going from a smaller error-correcting patch to a larger one actually cut the error rate of the protected information roughly in half, in the direction you need, again and again as you scale. That is the sign the whole field had been waiting decades to see, and it arrived quietly in a technical paper, without a fraction of the fanfare that the useless sprays of numbers received. And Willow is not alone. Behind it sits a whole landscape of serious engineering roadmaps, from IBM and others, laying out step-by-step plans to string these logical qubits together into machines with hundreds and eventually thousands of reliable error-corrected bits over the coming years. You're right to be a little wary of roadmaps, given everything we have seen about promises in this field. But there is a real difference between a roadmap for a commercial application which depends on finding a profitable problem the machine happens to be good at, and a roadmap for error correction, which depends only on the physics and engineering getting steadily better. The first is a bet about markets. The second is a bet about laboratories, and laboratories are exactly where this field has in fact kept delivering. So picture the two tracks running side by side, because this image is the resolution of the paradox we started with. On the upper track, brightly lit, loud, covered by the press, run the advantage demonstrations and the commercial promises, the 10,000 years and the 5-year forecasts and the billion-dollar projections. That track is littered with wreckage, with dissolved claims and expired predictions. If that were the only track, the cynics would be entirely right. But down below, on a quieter track that almost no camera points at, runs the real engineering, the patient, checkable work of making qubits less noisy and error correction actually function. That track has been moving forward the whole time. The tragedy, and the source of every misunderstanding, is that the public was only ever shown the upper track, and was told that its wreckage was the whole story of quantum computing, when in fact the meaningful progress was happening on the track below, out of frame. And this is where I want to bring back a phrase that has been running through this whole story like a refrain. It did not happen. We said it after every failed promise, and it sounded, each time, like an indictment. But sit with the phrase again now in light of the error correction progress, and notice that it can mean two very different things. It did not happen can mean it will never happen, the verdict of a cynic. Or it did not happen can mean it did not happen yet, the patience of someone watching a hard thing slowly come into being. The failed commercial promises really did not happen, but the useful machines they were promising may still someday be built, because the most fundamental barrier to them is, for the first time, visibly starting to fall. Not yet and never are different words, and almost the entire argument about quantum computing comes down to which of those two words you hear when you look at the evidence. Which brings us to the person who has made the case for not yet more carefully and more forcefully than anyone. A man who has spent his whole career refusing both the hype and the cynicism, and who read Amit Hager's paper and wrote a reply with a title as blunt as Hager's own. Part 9. The Believer's Case. His name is Scott Aaronson, and if you wanted to design a person to referee this exact argument, you could hardly do better. Aaronson is a theoretical computer scientist who has spent his entire career studying what quantum computers can and cannot do, and he has spent almost as much of it fighting a two-front war, pushing back against the breathless hype on one side and against the dismissive cynicism on the other. He is famous, in the field, for refusing to let anyone oversell quantum computing, and equally for refusing to let anyone write it off. So when Amit Hager's paper began circulating, Aaronson read it, and he wrote a reply, and his title was as blunt as Hager's own. Quantum supremacy, he wrote, and the whole noisy era did not fail. His argument is worth hearing carefully, because it is the strongest version of the optimistic case, and because it does not work by denying the failures. It works by separating two things that, he says, Hager and almost everyone else have been carelessly mashing together, and it is the same separation we have been building toward all night, stated by one of the people best qualified to state it. The first thing is quantum supremacy as a scientific milestone. Can a quantum computer, in principle and in practice, do a calculation that is genuinely, provably hard for any classical computer? On this, Aaronson is adamant, and his answer is yes, that milestone stands, and it did not fail. He grants everything we said about Sycamore, about the 10,000 years shrinking. But he points out something the deflationary story tends to skip. When classical computers caught up to the early, shallower demonstrations, the quantum teams did not give up. They built harder, more demanding versions, and for those, the classical methods still fail badly. Even the much-discussed recent techniques for simulating noisy quantum circuits on classical machines, he notes, still require an amount of time that grows exponentially with the depth of the circuit. Push the circuits far enough, as the newest machines from Google and others now do, and simulating them classically becomes hopeless again by every method anyone has found. So the gap did not vanish. It moved. The classical world caught the easy cases, and the quantum world responded by climbing to cases the classical world still cannot touch. The second thing is near-term commercial usefulness, the profitable applications, the revolution in medicine and finance. And here, Aaronson simply agrees with the critics. It is not there yet, he says, freely and without defensiveness. He does not pretend the commercial promises came true. He concedes that they did not. His whole point is that the failure of the second thing tells you nothing about the reality of the first. The science milestone can be genuine, and the commercial revolution can be absent at the same time because they were never the same claim. The mistake, he argues, was ever letting the public believe they were. Then Aronson offers an analogy that cuts right to the bone of the deflationary mood, and it is worth carrying with you. To say that quantum computing has been commercially stagnant for the last decade, he suggests, is a bit like standing in 1906 and complaining that heavier-than-air flight has been commercially stagnant for years. In a narrow sense, the complaint would even be true. In 1906 there were no airlines, no cargo planes, no paying passengers, no profit. But what a strange and incurious thing to focus on, when the actual historic event of that moment was that human beings had just, for the first time in the history of the species, gotten a heavier-than-air machine to fly at all. The technology had just crossed the line from impossible to possible. The commerce was decades away, and it came, and it changed the world. Aronson's claim is that quantum computing is at its own 1906. The machines have gone, in his words, from basically not working to basically working. Fixating on the missing profits, he thinks, is missing the actual miracle. And he adds one more point, the most fundamental of them, aimed squarely at the skeptics who suspect useful quantum computers may be impossible in principle. For that to be true, Aronson argues, there would have to exist an efficient way for ordinary computers to simulate any quantum system in nature, some hidden classical shortcut for all of physics, and nobody has ever found the faintest sign of such a shortcut. Everything we know about physics points the other way. So, he says, the burden of proof sits squarely on the skeptic. The strange, revolutionary, world-upending claim is not that quantum computers will eventually work. The strange claim would be that they cannot, because that would require the universe to be secretly, deeply simpler than a century of physics suggests it is. Aronson also points to something that answers Hagar on his own terms, and it connects back to that single exception we kept setting aside. Remember, Hagar conceded there was one demonstration that did not dissolve, one result that was genuinely hard, genuinely verifiable, and did not get reproduced classically. That was not a fluke. It was an early example of a new and better kind of demonstration, and more of them have been arriving. One is an experiment from Google's team that measures a subtle property of how quantum information scrambles and spreads through a system, a quantity that can be checked against the actual physics of the material rather than only against another computer. Because it is anchored to something real, it escapes the verification trap entirely. It is hard for classical machines, and it is checkable, and it is about something. That is the honest frontier, and the field has started to reach it. Even more telling, in Aronson's view, are quantum simulations of certain difficult physical systems, models of how electrons behave in two-dimensional materials, the kind of problem that sits at the root of understanding exotic magnets and superconductors. For the simplest one-dimensional versions of these models, ordinary computers do just fine. But for the harder two-dimensional versions, the classical methods start to buckle, and there are now cases where, Aronson argues, the best available estimates of certain physical quantities actually come from quantum computers rather than classical ones. Read that carefully, because it is a quiet milestone that never got a headline. Not a useless spray of numbers, but a real physical quantity, about a real physical system, where the quantum machine is currently giving the best answer anyone has. It is narrow, it is technical, and it is exactly the kind of genuinely useful advantage the commercial promises kept claiming was already everywhere. It is not everywhere. But for the first time, in a few small corners, it is somewhere. And the machines behind these results are, Aronson notes, no longer as fragile as the word noisy suggests. Some of the newest devices run complex, long-running circuits while maintaining a level of fidelity that would have seemed out of reach only a few years ago. The hardware really has crossed from barely functioning toward genuinely functioning, even if it has not yet crossed toward genuinely profitable. That is the distinction he keeps insisting on, and it is the distinction that makes his optimism something other than blind faith. I have laid Aronson's case out at length, and as fairly as I can, because it deserves that, and because you should feel the genuine two-sidedness of this argument rather than being handed a verdict. This is not a debate between honest people and liars. It is a debate between two careful, serious thinkers who agree on almost all the facts and disagree about what those facts mean. Hagar looks at the 8 years of dissolved demonstrations and sees a field that mistook press releases for progress. Aronson looks at the same 8 years and sees the awkward, messy, real birth of a genuinely new kind of machine, with the commercial payoff still over the horizon where it always honestly was. They are both looking at the same evidence. They are telling 2 different true-sounding stories about it, and that finally is the shape of the mismatch we started with. It is not a lie versus a truth. It is 2 truths, a real scientific advance and a failed commercial promise, that were braided together and sold as one. But there is still a piece missing, a question neither the deflationist nor the believer fully answers on their own. Even granting that the science is real and the commerce is not, why did the false half of the story travel so far, so fast, and last so long? Why did so many brilliant, honest people keep telling the commercial half of a story that kept not coming true? To answer that, we have to stop talking about physics altogether and start talking about money. Part 10. Follow the money. Amit Hagar has a phrase for what he thinks really happened, and it is the sharpest sentence in his paper, so I want to hand it to you whole. The press cycle of the past several years, he writes, has conflated engineering demonstrations with genuine computational advantage, and that conflation has been productive of funding without being productive of the meta-fact under investigation. Read it slowly, because it is doing something remarkable. He's not saying the results were fake, he's saying they were productive, they produced something, they just did not produce the thing they claimed to be about. What they reliably produced was money. Let me unpack that, because it is the missing piece, the thing that explains why the false half of the story travelled so far and lasted so long. Think of optimism in a field like this, not just as a feeling but as an economic engine, a living thing that feeds and grows. It works in a loop, and the loop turns like this. A hopeful forecast, a big number, a 5-year promise attracts capital from investors, from governments, from companies afraid of being left behind. That capital funds laboratories, hardware, teams. Those teams, under pressure to show results, produce demonstrations, advantage claims, the sprays of numbers we now understand so well. Those demonstrations generate headlines, and those headlines generate the next round of hopeful forecasts, which attract the next round of capital, and around it goes. Notice what this loop needs to keep spinning, and what it does not need. It needs announcements. It needs a steady supply of results impressive enough to make headlines. What it does not need, what it can run for years without, is the actual settling of the underlying scientific question. In fact, settling the question is almost beside the point, because whether the demonstration holds up or dissolves 18 months later, it has already done its job in the loop. It has already generated the headline, attracted the capital, and justified the next forecast, long before the quiet correction arrives. The machine runs on the announcement, not on the truth of the announcement. That is what Hagar means by productive of funding, but not of the meta-fact. The system was never really organized to find out whether quantum computers had won. It was organized to keep the loop spinning, and here I want you to slow all the way down, because this is the second great emotional turn of the night, and it is worth feeling in full. There is a specific kind of vertigo that comes from understanding this loop, and it is different from the vertigo of the demonstrations being built to lose. It is the realization that an entire system, made of thousands of intelligent, sincere people and billions of carefully allocated dollars, can organize itself for years around asking a question, funding the asking, celebrating the asking, building careers and companies and national strategies around the asking, without ever actually being structured to answer it. The money flows toward the question and away from the answer, because the question is where the excitement lives, and excitement is what the money is really buying. It is not corruption. Corruption you could root out. This is worse in a way because it is nobody's fault. It is an emergent property of how hope, capital and publicity feed each other, and it can run beautifully, self-sustaining for a very long time on a foundation that no one ever quite checks. To see it clearly is to feel the ground shift, not under quantum computing specifically, but under the whole idea that a well-funded, well-credentialed consensus must be tracking the truth. You can watch the loop run in real time in the stock market, which is where it becomes almost comically visible. There are publicly traded quantum computing companies whose share prices can leap by tens of % in a single day on the strength of a single announcement, a new chip, a new milestone, a new partnership, a hopeful comment from a chief executive. The announcement does not have to include revenue. It does not have to include a profitable customer. It only has to include the promise of progress toward the future everyone is waiting for. The value being traded is not the value of anything the company sells today. It is the value of the belief itself, priced and repriced by the hour. And that tells you something profound about what quantum computing has actually been, commercially, for the last decade. Its most liquid, most reliable product has not been computation, it has been anticipation. Which brings us back with a darker edge now to that wry line from earlier, the one about the only reliably profitable quantum application being the business of forecasting quantum applications. When we first said it, it sounded like a joke. Now you can see it is closer to a diagnosis. The forecasts really have moved real money. The consulting reports were sold, the investment rounds were raised, the share prices climbed, the national budgets were allocated. All of that economic activity was real and profitable, and it was built almost entirely on the anticipation of a payoff rather than the payoff itself. The prediction was the product, and a system in which the prediction is the product has very little reason to ever stop predicting, and very little reason to ever check whether the predictions came true, because checking is the one activity in the whole loop that could break it. Sit for a moment longer in how strange and how ordinary that is at the same time. We tend to imagine that when something goes wrong at this scale, when a whole field spends a decade and untold billions chasing a promise that keeps receding, there must be a culprit, a con artist, a cynical manipulator pulling strings. But there is no one here pulling strings. Each scientist is doing honest science. Each executive is honestly optimistic. Each investor is making a reasonable bet on a real technology. Each government is prudently hedging against a real strategic risk. Every individual link in the chain is behaving sensibly, and yet the chain as a whole produces a decade of confident, dated public promises that do not come true, and a mountain of money spent on the strength of them. The failure does not live in any person. It lives in the shape of the whole system, in the way the incentives interlock. And that is the most disturbing realization of all, because a failure with no author is a failure with no easy fix. How did it start? The most honest account, and it is close to the one in the source material that inspired this whole exploration, is that it began innocently in the universities. Academic scientists are by trade optimists about their own fields. They have to be, to spend a career on hard problems. And when quantum computing became exciting, that natural academic optimism, mostly harmless inside a physics department, leaked outward into industry, into startups, into consulting firms, into government strategy papers. And out there, in the world of markets and headlines, there was no one whose job it was to clean up the mess, no one to translate the careful academic maybe into the honest public, not for a long time yet. The maybe got amplified at every step, from the lab to the press release to the investor deck to the national initiative, and by the end it had become a confident, dated promise that the original scientist would never have signed. Geopolitics poured fuel on all of it. Once quantum computing was framed as a race between nations, once the fear took hold that whoever built the first useful machine might be able to break everyone else's codes and dominate the next century, no government could afford to be seen doing nothing. The fear of falling behind is one of the most reliable engines of spending ever discovered, and it does not require the technology to actually work on schedule. It only requires the possibility that a rival might get there first, and so the money kept flowing, not because anyone had shown the near-term payoff was real, but because no one could afford to bet that it was not. None of this, and this is crucial, means the underlying science is worthless, or that the useful machines will never come. Remember the quiet track, the real progress in error correction. The loop we have just described can be spinning on hype at the surface, while genuine advance grinds forward underneath. Both things are true at once, which is exactly what has made this whole subject so hard to see clearly. But there is one more twist to the story, a possibility stranger than anything we have discussed, raised by one of the most brilliant people alive. Because it may be that even the genuine long-term prize, the useful quantum machine that error correction is slowly making possible, arrives to find that something else has already taken its place. Part 11. The Ghost in the Machine. The possibility comes from Demis Hassabis, and to understand why it carries such weight, you have to know who he is and what he has already done. Hassabis is the co-founder of the artificial intelligence laboratory DeepMind, and he is by any measure one of the most accomplished scientific minds of his generation. He shared a Nobel Prize for work that solved one of biology's great puzzles, the problem of how proteins fold into their intricate three-dimensional shapes. And here is the detail that should make you sit up because it is almost too on the nose. Predicting how proteins fold was for years held up as one of the flagship future applications of quantum computing. It was on the list, one of the profound problems the quantum machines would finally crack. And then, before any quantum computer got near it, Hassabis and his team cracked it anyway, using classical artificial intelligence running on ordinary computers. Let that sink in. One of the marquee problems quantum computing was promising to solve someday was quietly solved, ahead of schedule, by a completely different technology, one that no one had folded into the quantum story at all. The future arrived. It just came through a different door. And this is what gives Hassabis' conjecture its unsettling power. He has argued that whatever quantum processes are actually happening in nature, in the folding of a protein, the bonding of a molecule, the behavior of a new material, those processes very likely contain rich regularities, patterns and structures that repeat and simplify. And if the patterns are there, then a sufficiently clever classical artificial intelligence may be able to learn them and model them well enough, on entirely ordinary hardware, without ever needing a quantum computer at all. In other words, nature may be quantum at the bottom, but the useful macroscopic consequences of that quantum behavior may be regular enough that classical machine learning can capture them. If he is right, then a huge portion of the promised quantum use case, the simulation of chemistry and materials that was supposed to justify the whole enterprise, might be quietly claimed by classical artificial intelligence before fault-tolerant quantum computers ever arrive to claim it themselves. Hassabis is careful, and so am I, to call this a conjecture, not a proven fact. Plenty of physicists think there will remain a hard core of genuinely quantum problems that no classical shortcut can touch, problems where you really will need a quantum machine. Aronson, for one, would argue that the most complex quantum systems resist exactly this kind of classical taming. This is an open question, not a settled one. But the source material that started this whole exploration made a pointed observation, and it is worth repeating. Too few people in the quantum field are taking Hassabis seriously enough, and you can understand why. If he turns out to be right, it does not just deflate a few demonstrations, it threatens the whole justification for the machines. There is a name, in fact, for the thing Hassabis is describing, or at least for its close cousin. Computer scientists call it dequantization, and it is a small but real and growing area of research. Dequantization is what happens when someone takes a problem that was believed to require a quantum computer, a problem where a quantum algorithm seemed to offer a clear speed-up, and finds a clever classical algorithm that matches it, erasing the quantum advantage entirely. It has happened more than once. A celebrated quantum machine learning algorithm, hailed as a major advantage, was later dequantized, shown to have an ordinary classical equivalent that worked nearly as well. Each time it happens, a little more of the promised quantum territory is quietly reclaimed by ordinary computers. Hassabis' conjecture is, in a sense, dequantization raised to a philosophy, the suspicion that far more of nature is classically learnable than the quantum enthusiasts assumed, and that the patient pattern-finding of artificial intelligence may keep chipping away at the quantum use case faster than the quantum machines can grow. And the protein folding story is the proof of concept that makes the conjecture impossible to wave away. For half a century, predicting a protein's shape from its sequence was considered one of the hardest problems in science, precisely the kind of deep quantum-flavored problem that seemed to demand exotic new computing. It was on every list of what the quantum future would deliver, and it fell, not to a quantum computer, but to a classical neural network that learned the regularities in the shapes of the proteins we already knew and generalized from them. The lesson was not lost on everyone. If the single most cited future application of quantum computing could be captured by classical artificial intelligence years ahead of any quantum machine, what else on the list might go the same way? I want you to picture the world this points toward, because it is the strangest image in the entire story. Imagine it is some year in the future, and the useful quantum computer, the one error correction has finally made possible, is switched on at last. After all the decades, all the billions, all the broken promises, here it is, real, working, fault-tolerant. And imagine that when its builders turn to the great problems it was meant to solve, the design of new medicines, the discovery of new materials, they find that the problems are already being solved, faster and more cheaply, by ordinary computers running artificial intelligence. The revolution arrived, But it is wearing the wrong face. It came dressed not in the strange quantum hardware everyone was watching, but in classical silicon nobody thought to guard against. And somewhere in a cold laboratory, a magnificent quantum computer, a genuine triumph of physics and engineering, hums away, producing its beautiful, verifiable, and by now almost entirely unneeded results, a monument to a future that the future itself decided to reach by another road. That is one possibility, and it may not come to pass. But it teaches the central lesson of this whole night, which is that the future is very bad at arriving in the costume we expect. And here is the final twist, the one that keeps the stakes real no matter which way the technology breaks. Even now, even as a commercially useless technology, quantum computing is already changing the world, through fear alone. Consider what is happening with the world's secrets right now, tonight. One of quantum computing's promised future powers is the ability to break the encryption that protects nearly everything digital: your bank account, your medical records, state secrets, the backbone of the internet. That machine does not exist yet, and by everything we have said, it may not for a long time. And yet, because it might exist someday, adversaries around the world are already acting. They are quietly collecting and storing enormous amounts of encrypted data they cannot read today, on the bet that a future quantum computer will one day let them decrypt it. The strategy even has a name: harvest now, decrypt later. Your encrypted secrets from this year could be sitting in a foreign archive right now, waiting for a machine that has not been built. And in response, governments and companies are racing to deploy entirely new kinds of encryption, so-called post-quantum cryptography, designed to resist a computer that does not yet exist and may never work as promised. There is something almost dreamlike about the position this puts us in. The threat is entirely conditional. It depends on a machine that does not exist running an algorithm discovered by the mathematician Peter Shor back in the 1990s that could in principle unravel the codes protecting the modern world, but only on a fault-tolerant quantum computer far larger and more reliable than anything built so far. Nobody knows for certain when or whether such a machine will arrive, and yet the mere credible possibility has been enough to set in motion one of the largest quiet security migrations in history. Standards bodies have spent years designing and approving new encryption methods. Governments have issued timelines for replacing the old codes. Banks and technology companies are already beginning the slow, expensive work of swapping out the mathematics that secures their systems. All of it is a defense against a weapon that has never been fired and may never be built. And the harvesting is the part that should stay with you, because it collapses the comfortable distance between the future and the present. Encrypted data does not spoil. A message you send today, safely scrambled by today's best encryption, can be copied and stored indefinitely. So an adversary does not need the code-breaking quantum computer to exist now. They only need to believe it might exist within the lifetime of the secret. Diplomatic cables, financial records, medical histories, the architecture of critical infrastructure, anything whose value lasts a decade or two, is worth stealing in its locked form today and simply holding, patiently, against the day the key arrives. Somewhere, right now, in archives you will never see, the encrypted traffic of this very year may be sitting in storage, waiting. Think about what that means. A technology that has produced in a decade essentially nothing you can buy, whose flagship demonstrations keep dissolving, whose commercial promises keep failing, is nonetheless already reshaping how the entire world stores and guards its most sensitive information. Not because of what it has done, because of what it might someday be able to do. The fear of the machine is already more powerful and more consequential than the machine itself, and that finally is enough of the picture to answer the question we started with, and to understand exactly what a growing number of scientists are beginning to realize and why it unsettles them so deeply. Part 12. What they are starting to realize. So let us finally answer the question we have carried all night. What is it that a growing number of scientists are starting to realize about quantum computers, and why do they find it disturbing? By now you can feel the shape of the answer, and it is not the answer either the enthusiasts or the cynics would give you. It is not that quantum computing is a fraud. We have seen too much real science for that. The physics is sound, the machines genuinely work, the progress in error correction is real, and, for the first time, the most fundamental barrier is visibly starting to fall. Anyone who tells you it is all a scam is making the mirror image of the hype's own mistake. ignoring the actual checkable achievement underneath. And it is not that the revolution is here either. A decade of dated, confident public promises about useful, profitable machines has come and gone, and the useful, profitable machine has not arrived, and the people who understand the field best admit, when pressed, that it is not close. What the honest ones are starting to realize is the thing in the space between those two verdicts, and it is harder to hold than either of them. It is that a real, slow, uncertain scientific achievement was dressed for a decade in the costume of an imminent commercial revolution, and that almost everyone helped, and that it worked. The demonstrations were built in a way that guaranteed they would be overtaken, and the field applauded them anyway. The promises reset their clocks every few years and were believed fresh each time. The money flowed toward the asking of the question, and away from the answering of it, and none of it required a single villain. It required only thousands of sincere people, each behaving reasonably, inside a system whose shape rewarded confidence over correction. That is the disturbing part. Not that someone lied, but that no one had to. And now, let me give you back the 3 things I asked you to hold on to, because each of them has quietly changed its meaning over the course of the night. The first was that image from the cold laboratory, the magnificent machine producing, after all its effort, a spray of numbers no one needed, a calculation with no known use. We have followed that phrase a long way, and here is where it lands. The truth is that quantum computing over this past decade did produce something enormously useful. It just was not a calculation. What it produced, reliably and at scale, was belief, and the funding that belief attracted. The most valuable thing the machines generated was not their output. It was the anticipation of their output. The useless spray of numbers turned out to be the most productive product in the whole story, not because of what it computed, but because of what it convinced people to fund. The second thing was that flat little refrain, "It did not happen," the words we said after every broken promise. And you will remember that it can be heard 2 ways. As a verdict, it did not happen, meaning it never will. Or as patience, it did not happen yet. The disturbing realization does not resolve into either one. The commercial promises genuinely did not happen, full stop, and pretending otherwise for another decade would be its own kind of dishonesty. And the useful machines genuinely might still happen someday, because the real barrier is finally starting to give way. The whole maturity of the thing lies in holding both of those at once, in refusing both the cynics never and the enthusiasts now, and sitting instead in the harder, truer space of not yet, which is where honest people actually live. And the third thing was the quietest, the one about John Preskill, the man who named this era and then declined to promise it would pay off. Sometimes the relevant part is not what the confident voices say. Sometimes it is what the most careful person in the room chooses not to say. That was true of Preskill, and it turns out to be the single most useful skill you can carry out of this whole story. When you next hear a confident, dated promise about a technology that will change everything within 5 years, do not only listen to the promise, listen for who is not making it. Notice which of the genuine experts has gone quiet, and ask yourself what their silence is protecting. In a hallway full of people announcing the dawn, the person standing quietly to one side is very often the one worth listening to, and here is where the whole thing turns from an accusation into something gentler and much more useful if you let it. It would be easy to walk away from this story angry, looking for someone to blame, some villain who sold us a decade of vapor. But we have looked, carefully, and the villain is not there. What is there instead is a mirror. Because the mechanism that produced all of this, the way a shared confidence can hold itself up on nothing but its own momentum, the way a crowd of sincere and intelligent people can believe something together for years without anyone checking the flaw, is not a flaw in quantum physicists. It is a flaw in us, in the ordinary human way of knowing. We are pattern believers. We trust confidence, especially credentialed confidence, especially confidence that everyone around us seems to share, and that trust is usually reasonable, and occasionally it walks a whole civilization off the edge of a promise that was never real. So the truly disturbing realization, the one the honest scientists are sitting with, is not really about machines at all. It is about how hard it is, even for the smartest people in the world, working in the most rigorous field we have, to say 3 small and unglamorous words at the moment everyone around them is saying the opposite. This did not happen. Not this did not happen because you are a fool, or because I am smarter than you, but simply, quietly, this did not happen yet, and I am not going to pretend otherwise just because the room wants me to. That sentence costs something. It costs funding and status and the warm feeling of belonging to a confident crowd. Preskill paid that cost when he declined to promise. Hagar paid it when he wrote his blunt little paper. And the reason their restraint matters so much is that it is rare, and that its rarity is exactly what let the story run as long as it did. There is a strange comfort in seeing this clearly, though, and it is the comfort I want to leave you with. Because if the failure has no villain, then it also has no monster. There is nothing here to be afraid of, only something to understand. The people building these machines are not con artists. They are explorers who got a little lost in their own excitement, the way explorers always have. And the machines themselves are genuinely extraordinary, whatever they turn out to be good for. The disappointment, when you look at it without anger, is not really a disappointment at all. It is just the ordinary, humbling gap between how fast we hope the future will come and how slowly it actually arrives, a gap that every generation discovers again for itself, and that every generation somehow is surprised by. Because in the end, this was never really a story about qubits, or superposition, or error rates. Those were the surface. Underneath, this was a story about how a civilization decides what to believe about its own future, about who gets to make the promises and who profits from them, and how long it takes for the careful voices to be heard over the confident ones. Quantum computing just happens to be the clearest recent example we have of a pattern that runs through everything, through every technology, every market, every grand collective hope. The pattern where a real thing and a story about the real thing get braided so tightly together that even the experts, even now, struggle to say where one ends and the other begins. Think, for a moment, about how long that pattern has been running, long before quantum computers, long before computers of any kind. Every generation has had its 5 years away miracle, its technology that would remake the world by a date that came and went. Flying machines that would end war by making it unthinkable. Atomic power too cheap to meter. Cities on the ocean floor and colonies on Mars by the turn of a century that has since turned. Some of those promises came true, decades late and in forms nobody predicted. Some are still waiting. Some quietly never arrived at all. And in every case the shape of the story was the same, a real seed of possibility wrapped in a story that outran it, and a long patient gap in between where the actual work got done, unglamorously, by people the headlines had already forgotten. Quantum computing is not special in this. It is only the latest, clearest instance of the oldest habit we have, the habit of confusing what is possible with what is imminent. There is a kind of peace available on the far side of that recognition. Once you stop needing the future to arrive on schedule, you can look at these machines, these cold, gleaming, improbable machines, and simply appreciate them for what they actually are, which is remarkable enough without any promise attached. Human beings took the strangest, most counterintuitive rules ever discovered about the fabric of reality, the rules of the quantum world that even the physicists admit they do not fully understand, and they built a working machine out of them. That is true, and it is astonishing, and it remains true whether or not that machine ever earns $1 or breaks a code. The wonder was never in the promise. It was in the thing itself, quietly humming in the cold, exploring a space of possibility larger than the visible universe, for no reason anyone can yet name. And maybe that is the most honest and the most calming thing to carry with you into sleep tonight. The universe is not obligated to arrive on our schedule or in the costume we sewed for it. The genuine achievements are almost always slower and quieter and stranger than the promises made in their name. The useful quantum computer may still come, years from now, through a door we are not watching, or the future it was meant to build may arrive by some other road entirely, wearing a face we did not expect. Either way, the work that lasts is the patient kind, done far from the headlines, by people willing to say the unglamorous, unfundable, deeply human words that this whole story turned on. Not yet. We do not know. Let us keep looking. And that is exactly what a growing number of scientists are starting to realize about quantum computers, and why, in the quietest way, they find it so disturbing and so oddly freeing all at once.